So welcome back everybody to the channel. My name is Nick. If you don't already know me, I make all sorts of Forex content here on YouTube for free. I do ask, however, if my content is helpful to you, make sure you give this video a thumbs up down below and also subscribe to the channel if you are new. So today we're talking trend lines. We're talking all about how to draw them, how to kind of use them in your own analysis, and potentially some trading strategies that you can use using trend lines. Now there's different ways that you can trade using trend lines, and some people will even debate that you shouldn't use them at all because they say they're kind of subjective and people draw them in different ways, which they absolutely do. So the best way to start is to take a look at the charts here, I think, and to talk a little bit about what it means to use a trend line. Now a trend line, there's many different ways to draw it. So a lot of times people will be, well, Nick, how do you actually draw a trend line? Do you draw it across the tops? Do you draw it across the closes of bars? How do you actually use and draw these trend lines? Take a look here at the chart. What you can see is that Euro USD, this is a daily chart. And there's a couple different ways we could draw this. If we were just drawing across the highs, you would say, okay, we'll draw across only the highs of this move, which would give you this line. But here's the thing, guys. If you also draw it across the close, well, then you get slightly different of a trend line, right? You get this trend line, right? And so it becomes a little bit controversial because some people will say, well, you should draw across the tops. And some people say, well, you should draw across the close. So Nick, which is it? Which is the correct one? And I would say that the correct way to trade using trend lines is not necessarily just to follow what everybody else is saying you should do, but rather just to use trend lines, in my opinion, as more of a zone. Now, you may have heard on my channel before that support and resistance, or horizontal support and resistance, such as a line like this, right, to me is not so much of a pinpoint price, but rather a kind of zone, right? So zones of support and resistance, you can see if I just get this, you can say that this zone was a support zone or a buy zone. Well, in the same way, when I'm looking at trend lines, I'm going to trade trend lines in a similar fashion. I'm going to look at trend lines as a zone of resistance, which is a little bit different because it's diagonal, right? Which might be a little bit confusing at first, but for the most part, that's how I'm going to look at trend lines. I'm going to look at them as a zone, just as I would with support and resistance. Why? Well, the charts are not perfect. The way the markets are moving is not pinpoint all the time because there are a lot of factors going into the way that the market is actually moving. So now that we know how to draw a trend line, at least in my opinion, the best way to draw it is a line of best fit or kind of a zone structure, which if you draw it, kind of what I would draw, if I was looking at Euro USD, this is how I would draw it. I would not get so nitpicky. I would just take my trend line and I would draw it across what I see on the charts, which you can see it ended up being a little bit closer to the closes. But again, it's not a perfect pinpoint. I'm not so nitpicky about my trend lines that I can only do it one way. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. I'm pretty kind of narrow, or not narrow, but kind of not specific about my trend lines. I just draw a trend and a structure that I see in the market with my eyes, right? Because people are going to see it differently. People are going to draw it differently. So there's not going to be a perfect way to always draw a trend line because people are going to be trading it differently. So now that we've got a trend line drawn, you can see I've just drawn basically my representation of this trend line zone, right? This kind of trend line zone here is really what I'm looking for. So that's where I'd be looking to sell. And in fact, in the VIP service that I offer, where you can track along with some of my trades, I've actually been selling the Euro USD quite a bit in favor of the US dollar because of what the Fed has been up to. The US dollar has been pushing very, very strong. So there's a fundamental side there as well that also contributes to this strong downward trend line. Right, so you have these resistance zones or kind of trend line zones that price is rejecting from. So as price rallies into that area, that becomes a level for sellers and a place of where buyers are taking profits. Right, so we see that again and again here on Euro USD, looking at that trend line concept. So when we're talking about a trend line, we're talking about the market making a movement in the direction of a trend. How do we actually trade in kind of tandem with these trend lines? Well, there's a couple different ways. Some people will trade in the direction, kind of trading alongside the trend, trading in the direction of the trend line and catching bounces, just as we've mentioned here, right? So as price came into that level of value, there could be opportunities to look for sell trades in favor of this downward trend. That is kind of the bread and butter, simple way to look at trend lines. So that's step one. That's kind of at least how I like to look at trend lines in a lot of ways. I really like a trend line bounce concept. So as price pulls back, it's simply a pullback concept. As price goes down, right? We wait for a pullback, and as price comes into an area of value, you look to sell in favor of the next move to the downside. And this is just riding the context of a trend. Now, there's another way that we can look at trend lines, however, which we can see here on Euro USD. You can see that when the trend line breaks, oftentimes we get a big move on a new trending market. What that means is that as the market was moving down, the sellers were in total control. But when this line breaks, when price fails to close lower and continue lower, that can be a signal for buyers or for people who are on the other side of the trend to rally and to push price strongly. So as price was selling off here, it was very clear to market participants that sellers were in control. But when price was not able to close back underneath and price did not rally back down, we actually saw a rally in the bull side direction. And that's really what happens a lot of times when you get these trend line breaks. And this is really a trend line break strategy, which there's a lot of people who will trade this concept. People really like this, myself included. This is another concept that can be really nice. Now there's some ways that you can trade a trend line break. And the one way is to trade aggressively, right? Meaning that as a price breaks through, you look to just aggressively get involved with the market. Let's say that you buy here, right? So as price breaks out of that level of resistance, that zone or trend line level of resistance, we can look to buy in favor of the new market move. Now you might say, well, isn't that buying the highs? Well, maybe you could make that argument, but in some ways, this market is already far down, right? We've moved to the downside and we may have some real room to run on the bull side here. And that's exactly what we saw here on Euro USD. Price broke up above, closed outside of that trend line, right? That's one way to look at these. A close outside of this major trend line, which we had not seen yet. When we saw that market close above, that was a potentially bullish sign and we saw some rally to the upside. Again, this is something that we see again and again in markets. We have a strong trend line, it breaks, structure kind of gets rejected or disrespected, and we see a continuation to the opposite direction. So that's another way that you can trade trend lines. You can trade either the bounce off of a trend line, or you can trade the break or breakout of a trend line. Now there's also ways within each of those contexts to trade it. I won't go into super detail because I have videos on each of those concepts. But generally, if you see a breakout, you can either trade the aggressive style, which I mentioned, which is just buying the break, or you can wait for some sort of retest and get involved on the trend line. That's another way that people really like to trade trend lines, is you see a break of structure, you wait for a value retest, right? A test back on that trend line, and then you buy in favor of that new potential trend. So that's a trend line break. But if you're trading the bounce, if you're trading the continuation of a trend line, well, what are you going to do when you get involved with a trade? Well, of course, one popular way is to sell into a trend line like this. Let's say that you decide to sell here, right? You put a stop above your kind of area of resistance, right? You really don't want to see price move too much against you. Otherwise, we might be getting one of these scenarios, right? So if you sell here, you put a stop above structure, and then you could look to take profits at recent lows. Well, where are recent lows? We can look left on the chart, and this may have been a good area to take profit. That would be a simple trend continuation concept in favor of the dominant move to the downside, right? And so you can kind of use the same concept on the buy side here if you were to trade the trend line break. Check this out. If we bought, let's say here after the major break, if you buy here, you could put a target at a structural point of resistance. Well, you may say, how do we do that? Well, this is where support and resistance in the horizontal form can come into confluence or help us out with our trend lines. You could say this level here is interesting, right? You also have this level here, right? Kind of using structure to our advantage on the horizontal and on the trend line structure kind of ways, right? So hopefully that's helpful. Those are just two of the main ways that I see trading trend lines. I find trend lines to be very interesting and helpful in my analysis. And I will say that sometimes, again, it can be controversial. Sometimes people will draw them in different ways, but I don't get too bogged down in that. I don't get caught up in that debate very much. I just draw trend lines kind of as a line of best fit to show me the general direction and the general trend of a market, and to see where markets may potentially be breaking out and where they may potentially be continuing in the direction of a trend. For the most part, my way of trading trend lines is going to be a combination of both of these concepts and looking to see what the market gives me. Sometimes people will wait for some sort of confirmation in the form of candlestick patterns and horizontal support and resistance levels to confirm or give themselves a better chance of success at trading either the breakout or the continuation of a trend line. Hopefully that makes sense, guys. Thanks very much for watching. Make sure to subscribe down below if you are not already, and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks very much. We'll catch you next time.